All right, we're going to get started. I know there's still a few people in the bathroom. I hope you all found the film enlightening and thought-provoking. I'm excited to welcome to the stage our panelists to further flesh out these important issues. Producer Adam Krell, as well as Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, the Canon Theologian at the Washington National Cathedral, and Jim Wallis, the founding director of the Georgetown University Center on Faith and Justice. Please come up and take a seat. We'll have Jim, if you want to sit here. Oh, sorry. That's perfect. All right. Okay. In 2025, there is a lot to digest about what is happening when it comes to race and religion. The new presidential administration is working to dismantle anti-discrimination law and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including firing anyone involved in those efforts in the federal government. In a nearly unprecedented move, President Trump fired his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, the second black man to serve in that important national security role. The now Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, questioned Brown's qualifications in a book he wrote prior to taking his position, asking, was it because of his skin color or his skill? We'll never know. And President Trump has ordered the establishment of a task force on eradicating anti-Christian bias. This is one of the many ways that the issues addressed in the documentary tie directly to the headliners today. In this documentary, we can see the contradiction of an American society that values freedom and equality against the backdrop of a history of slavery, segregation, and racism, and how religion both fuels division and promotes reconciliation. What will be the future for freedom and equity in this country? Is there still a path to reconciliation? Before we dive into this discussion, but just a quick reminder, in order to ask a question, there are cards on the seats in the audience, and our staff member, Madison or Cecily, there's Madison right there, she will pick them up from you and bring them to me. So feel free to fill them out whenever you think of a question. Just wave it in the air and she'll come get it. And that'll be great. And just make sure to print legibly before, just do that, so I can actually read it. Thank you. All right, so we'll get started. I wanted to ask, just to get going on this, what part of the documentary that you're not in, and Adam, you can answer this in a different way, sticks with you the most and why? We can get started with Jim, since you're right next to me, and then we'll go to the Reverend.
The emotional moment for me was Darren Ferguson taking his oath of office at the Orange City Police Department. He told me about this, but I'd never seen it before. And I'll tell you how I met Darren Ferguson. A lot of book writers in this crowd. When you write a book, people say, hey, my group read your book. Could you come and talk to us about it? Pretty standard letter that you get. I got one of those to an old book, and it said, and we're inmates at Sing Sing prison. So that's interesting. A usual book club. So I wrote back and I said to the brother who wrote me, which was Darren, I said, well, yeah, I'd like to come. When do you want me to come? He said, well, we're free most nights. We're kind of a captive audience here. And there must have been 200 guys in the basement of one of those infamous prison cells. And here's what he said, Darren. He said, so I want you to know, Jim, that 3 out of 4 members of Sing Sing are from 3 or 4 neighborhoods in New York City, the whole prison. 3 or 4 neighborhoods in New York City. It's like a train, he says, comes through neighborhoods like mine. You get out when you're 9 or 10 years old, and the train ends up here at places like Sing Sing. A train, metaphor I never forgot, going to only certain zip codes and ending up at places like Sing Sing. That's what it means. That's what racism means. And he's a bishop now. We keep close. He spoke in my class at Georgetown. He's doing it all. But the emotional thing I felt after the film was, I forgot all about this film. I did.
It's been a long time in the
Yeah, it's been a long time. But it's very timely right now. Everything about all this history is happening right now. Department of Justice had a big 60th celebration of the Civil Rights Act in '64. Last year I went to it. And it wasn't the usual older people saying, we've made progress. Young people saying, not enough, not enough. That's the usual thing. This was like a funeral service. And Kristen Clark, Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights, and I were talking afterwards. The Attorney General came up to talk to us. And they both said, we're afraid all of our history of 60 years is about to be erased. Erased. That's what they're doing now. This new regime is trying to erase whatever progress we have made. So as much as I talk about repair with my sister here, and how through repairing we'll get to reconciliation, I gotta say tonight, repairing depends upon resistance. Resistance right now by all of us to what's going on. I'll leave it there.
Reverend, I'll let you take it over. You're next.
Next.
It's hard to follow.
Yes,
I'm sure you can do it though.
And first, I'd like to thank you, Adam, and thank your father for this film. And I thank you for inviting me to be a part of this journey with you and your father. And I am humbled to have been a part of this journey with you. And so thank you. And please thank your father. And to thank you and the National Press Club.
Thanks for coming.
For the invitation to be here and for showing this film. Probably the most touching part and emotional part of this film for me was, in fact, when Tyrone Brown was speaking with Bishop Ferguson. And what struck me was this young black man, young to me, trying to figure out how you got here.
Yeah.
And what struck me is that no one is born saying, I can't wait to become a criminal. I can't wait to end up in prison. People come into this world, for the most part, with dreams and hopes, and their parents have dreams and hopes for them. And Tyrone had a dream, right? And this is what happened to him because of circumstances. And, you know, even if he didn't make the best choices, clearly, but he also didn't have an opportunity to make even better choices, right? He had limited choices. And so that's what struck me. And I have a son now, an adult son. He's 32 years old. And I thought, that could be Desmond, right? That Tyrone Brown didn't deserve that. And he's not, as Brian Stevenson always reminds audiences he talks to, that we are not the worst thing that we've ever done. And so all of that struck me and in this film.
Adam.
Well, I guess I would say probably that same scene for me is probably the most special. As you know, as a filmmaker, when you're in the room in that moment, and when when people allow you to be there in a very vulnerable moment, that was very hard for Tyrone to cry and to do it on camera. That was really like tough for him. He's got his shell. He doesn't. That's a hard thing for him to do, but he did open up, and a lot of that, of course, had to do with Darren Ferguson, because he's able to connect with them. But those are the moments, as filmmakers, are like, you strive to capture reality, and I feel that in that moment we were able to do that.
It's interesting, we picked the same scene in the film, and I want to thank you too. I was feeling a lot of stuff afterwards, but I want to thank you too. And the timeliness of this is crucial. The way Darren Ferguson pastored that young man in a way that only probably someone like him could do it, is how do we do the pastoral and the prophetic at the same time? That's a question for me.
All right. Do you have an answer to that?
Well, I was on the phone today doing a podcast just before here with a young guy who was a white neo-Nazi skinhead into all of this, what has become Christian nationalism. He was in it, but he was a drummer, and a church needed a drummer. He needed some money, so he joined the church orchestra as a drummer. He got converted in that church. Now he's the pastor of that church, Caleb Campbell. And now he studied this white Christian nationalism went to all their meetings, thought they'd recruited him. He was doing investigative reporting as a theologian now. And he now sees them as his mission field. Mission field. And we talked on the podcast about how he's having conversations, setting the table. He said Jesus overturned tables, but he set more tables. So how do we set the table for conversations about how to bring Christian nationalists back to Jesus? Because they've lost their way in this. He calls it the Leviathan, the beast, that for history has always used the language of God for the most evil purposes. The film was full of that.
Yeah.
And so we had a great talk about how you speak the truth to power. Pastors have to speak up right now, but how they can pastor even people who are caught up in, he makes a good point. The things he went to were not just political rallies like some of us who are critics like to say. They were church. They were religion. They were calling out people's faith for this evil purpose of white Christian nationalism. So that's going to be the big question. How do you reach out to people, try to pastor people, while you stand up and speak the truth to power?
Now, I've got to ask, since the new administration began what feels like a very long time ago, or maybe a day ago, it's hard to keep track, really. What have you seen in terms, and maybe Reverend, this is a question for you, in terms of people turning out to church? Is it potential? Are there more people turning to religion in this time? What's sort of the impact that you're seeing at where you are, or hearing from others who are also involved in various churches in the area, especially here in Washington? I'm just curious what that landscape is looking at now.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you've asked that question now, because I was just commenting after Ash Wednesday, which was, of course, on Wednesday, to my husband and indeed to my son, that I continue to work as, at the Washington National Cathedral, so we had Ash Wednesday services, the noon and the 7 o'clock service. And usually it's a nice, group of people, but it's not huge on Ash Wednesday. Both services were packed.
Wow.
I commented, when I got home, I was stunned.
Yeah.
And the people, as they were leaving the church, and we greet them at the back, were commenting, we needed this, right? And so I think, and some of, not sort of the usual suspects that, I would expect to see.
Yeah.
They were sort of younger, sort of generation beneath me or my son's generation. They were there, right? And both services, as well as at the cathedral after Bishop Buddy, the Sunday after Bishop Buddy's remarks, the cathedral was again packed, but again, what struck me were sort of youngish people coming up and saying, oh, we were wondering where we could find a place, right? And so my idiosyncratic experience has been that people are coming back to the church because people are feeling unmoored and not quite knowing what to do. And so I would say yes, from my vantage point, that I've seen people returning and I've seen a new generation in the church.
Here's an Ash Wednesday story back to you. My wife, Joy, as you know, is an Anglican Church of England, but Episcopal priest. So at St. Columba's, she was doing Ash Wednesday Wednesday, and Panera Bread on the corner there by the church is where they do ashes on the run, to people who are just passing by and won't come to church. So she's quite out there as a priest, and she went up to this group of about a dozen former Wilson students, young kids. It's now Austin Reed. And she said, hey, anybody want to have ashes put on their forehead? And they responded like teenage, wow, what's that? And this one kid said, is that Christian? Is that Christian? She says, yes, it is. What does it mean? And she told this young teenager what it meant. Do it for me. And they all did it on Wisconsin Avenue outside of
That's a tough get.
Panera,
Wow.
So I wonder if you think that this Lenten season that we're in, we have said we need to return to Jesus during Lent. Whether this moment, these facts, this history, this crisis, could be an opportunity of people, even during Lent, coming back to church because they're looking for something. What to do, what it means for me. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think that people are feeling unmoored and that people are looking for something. And, whether or not it's coming back to Jesus,
It makes you feel proactive.
Right.
There's not much you can do,
Exactly.
but you can at least do that.
You can do that, and I think what we have to return to and what we have to help people to reclaim and even understand what's lost is our very humanity, right? And so to reconnect to what it simply means to be human. And I think in many of the episodes and during the journey, and I remember when you and your dad were with us on the pilgrimage, that what's striking is just that, even sort of across the sort of the theme, the overall theme is, what it means to be human, our best humanity, kindness, compassion, decency, and you're just struck. It's sort of like listening to Joanne Bland. How do a people, as she said, beat 11-year-old and 14-year-old children crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge? Don't you see these are children? The opening scene that you filmed with George Floyd's aunt, right? This is a human being. George Floyd is a human being, and I loved this picture of the sort of paradox of he is a little boy in his mother's arms, right? And then we hear him as his aunt describes, and we all saw him being killed by the police officer. And you're thinking, how come someone couldn't see
Yeah.
that this was somebody's little boy?
Yeah.
And so I think when you talk about returning to something, I think that we have to return and somehow reclaim just our very humanity. And if faith communities doesn't have to be Christian or can do anything, it is to lead the way and model and articulate what it simply means to be human,
Yeah.
right?
And for Christians, it might mean, what did Jesus say about all this? What should we do? But this could cross boundaries of all of our faith traditions and even go beyond our faith traditions to some of those young people in the street who probably weren't going anywhere to a service. So how could this be a moment to bring us back really to Genesis 1, that we are all made in the image and likeness of God?
I think that's also an interesting point too. In the documentary, they talked a little bit of, somebody was talking a little bit about the research that they had been doing, on race and religion, and that, churches are very divided still.
Yeah.
Could this be a moment to break down some of those divisions that we see in present society? Just what are your thoughts on that potentially?
Yeah, I think that, yes, and as the film showed, and as Robbie Jones and spoke about, that when we have a divided society, you're going to have segregated churches, right? And particularly when people are having two distinctly different experiences in the same society. And so people who share experiences usually worship together, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, unfortunately, that when we all share, perhaps in different ways, but share the reality of what it means to be on the other side, on the underside of justice, mm-hmm. and share the reality of inequality, and unfortunately, mm-hmm. More people across racial lines, and we're seeing across economic lines,
Yes.
are beginning to share that reality. And so, unfortunately, suffering can bring people together.
Right.
And I think that that is one of the things when you talk about this moment, that shared suffering brings people together. And that's unfortunate, but it is so. And shared suffering also is that which allows you to recognize even more fully your shared humanity, right? And you reach out to one another. And so I think we have to articulate that. We have to, as faith leaders, articulate, again, our shared humanity and find ourselves as people in the places that we can, find ourselves as people connecting with those who suffer.
You went to Selma, and this is the anniversary of Bloody Sunday.
Great. Oh, no, please go ahead. No, you're good.
Bloody Sunday, this is the anniversary. So we had an event
That's
last
right,
night with Terry Sewell, Congresswoman from Selma, and a historian and a strategist about what happened then, suffering, and how that could teach us about what could happen now.
I did want to ask about the Cavalry Lutheran Church as an example of an inclusive environment that seeks to confront intersection of religion and racism. And what characteristics do you think religious organizations like Calvary Lutheran Church exhibit that are successful in sort of detangling the racist sentiments from individual and communal spirituality, if you will?
Well, they're not. The congregation was still. There are very few African Americans in the congregation, so they weren't really. I wouldn't say they were an example of a multiracial church. I forget there is a number that they consider like a 20%, at least 20% minority would be considered a multiracial church. We very much considered, we wanted to do a scene about a multiracial church in terms of, we thought that would be really interesting particularly because of the Martin Luther King quote, the most segregated time in America is at 11 a.m. every Sunday. So we wanted to kind of explore that a bit more. But as we were, developing it and thinking about it, one thing we kind of bumped into is that some of these multiracial churches, they kind of run into their own problems because the African American church tradition is its own church. And when you try to bring these two churches together, that creates some problems, or just the white sort of heads of the church sort of stay in place, and they're just trying to fill their pews with more people, and sometimes something gets a little lost or watered down in translation. So we didn't find a great example of a church that we wanted to show in the film in that way, and we felt like it was maybe better just to show the strengths of each church and the possibilities that each church has within social justice.
Adam, you began making this documentary shortly after the George Floyd murder. What changed over the course of the process, in terms of how you were thinking about the direction of the film at the beginning and how it turned out in the end? I mean, that was 2020, so just give us a sense of the journey of putting together this film and the messages that you decided to really hone in on as part of this.
Well, one scene that I think we kind of struggled with at the time, and even now watching it, is I have mixed feelings about, if I to be honest, is the voting rights scene, particularly after what's just happened. Not in terms of the importance of what they were doing, but first of all, watching it now, you're like, gosh, is this even at the time, those issues of voting rights and chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, and what was happening, all this messing about with the voting, access and such, that seemed like that was a big deal, and it is a big deal. But now it just feels like, whoa, wow, we got some bigger, bigger problems now.
Shouting into a void,
Yeah. So now it's unfortunate that all of a sudden, to me, in a way that scene, while brings up important points, as you say, we're in a different age, and now the resistance has to be different.
Yet, Adam, that scene is almost prophetic, right? Because our voting rights have been destroyed. Yeah. The Voting Rights Act has been invalidated, and there is a even more rapid. It's not even chipping away, a more rapid taking away of voting rights. I was just speaking with my best friend who's down here with us, as we were walking over today, talking about the way in which women are being disfranchised by having to show voter IDs. If you're married, you have to show an ID that has your pre-married name on it.
So get your birth certificate changed? I don't know.
Right, and this just impacted my sister yesterday in Ohio, because she was trying to get a real voter ID, or the real license. Yeah. The real license in Ohio, and she's been a widow for 3 years, and they asked her for her birth certificate, which she had that. Then they asked her for her marriage license, which she didn't have. She said, well, my husband's been dead for 3 years. I don't know where it is. So she couldn't get her real ID. So she has to go somewhere and find her marriage certificate. So this notion, so I thought actually it was very prescient.
Who was in that film, we do this thing called Face United Save Democracy. We trained 1,500 poll chaplains to go to very vulnerable polling places in nonviolence, but what we're facing now, we're having a call tomorrow night, is given there's bills in Republican legislatures that would require birth certificates, marriage certificates, or passports and a bill in Congress to do the same. So we're facing, in even this next election, anyone who thinks we can solve this in 2 years with an election, we're not sure what's going to happen even in those elections. Would the people running things now concede to fair and free elections, even in 2026? So, but back to your point there, I think you did that Calvary thing, because it's a narrow view to say we have to integrate our churches in the midst of all of our segregation. It's more that that church was serving its community. Yeah. When they put the plaque up, you know, and the woman who spoke to them with emotional thanks, she wasn't even a member of the church. But so what if we in the churches, what if young people walked by our churches and said, I don't know I believe everything going on in there, but that's where we have our town meetings on gun violence. Mm-hmm. That's where we talk about crisis in the community. So you beautifully showed how Calvary Church was serving its community and suffered for it, and then found another way to serve the community. So that's where we come together, around the needs of our community, not trying to put all of our worship styles together in one place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Because that's what it means to be church.
Yeah.
Right, and so what struck me even with the Calvary Church is that they won't have the building, but that doesn't mean that they aren't church. In fact, without the building, they can live even more into what it means to be church. You know, because I often say that we have to make it, to call ourselves church is aspirational. And we have to make the decision whether or not we're going to live into what it means to be church, or whether or not we're just going to be another social institution that happens to be religious. And what Calvary is an example of is a people that are trying to live into what it means to be church, which sometimes means that you have to free yourself from the building that is preventing you from being church, because you're spending all of your time trying to upkeep the building. And in the meantime, your community is falling apart and you have forgotten what it means to be church. And so I thought, I didn't know why you chose Calvary, but it turned out that it seemed to me that that was a perfect example of what it means to say, okay, but we still have to be church. And so we'll let the building go, but let it go in a way that it continues to still serve the community. And I don't know, I wanted to ask you, in fact, Adam, have they built the housing?
They have. We do
Great.
have. I think we may have missed it because we were getting mic'd up, but there is a little.
Okay. So
there is a moment there where we have photos of the new building.
Oh, great.
And in fact, we did screen the film at the new church, and it was really quite powerful, very interesting how they reacted.
Since you filmed that, we both know there's a movement afoot, particularly among Episcopal bishops across this country, who are turning their property around their churches into housing for low-income people. Bishop of Los Angeles is doing that. There's all kinds of things happening, and with Episcopal bishops in particular. And they're doing what you showed in the film, and they're using their property. Lots of church property is not being used for anything. And if you use it for low-income housing, that creates a whole new community around that church. So I think you did that very well, and that's happening now in ways I'd never imagined before. I saw it around the country.
I wanted to ask, we were talking about some of the things that are threatening, efforts when it comes to achieving equality in America. Currently, voting rights is one. There's many things going on. Given what we've seen, and it's been a fire hose, what are currently, in your mind, the biggest threats to achieving some level of equality, reconciliation, whatever you want to call it, that puts us in a better place? What are some of the biggest threats that you are seeing right now?
Well, one, Christian nationalism is always us versus them. That's what they're doing. So the Department of Homeland Security rescinded its sensitive locations protections. Been in place for 30 years, bipartisan. And now ICE agents can enter, raid churches to arrest undocumented people.
Yeah.
So we filed this lawsuit against Homeland Security, and the whole Episcopal Church is a plaintiff in the lawsuit. 12 national church, AME Zion is there,
Okay.
and we filed an injunction. This is Georgetown lawyers with our center at Georgetown, and it's in the courts now. So a number of things are in the courts now, and it's a new partnership between some of us in the faith community and the courts. But what Hispanic leaders tell me all the time is that threat keeps Latino Christians from going to church. They're afraid to go to church or go get the food pantry or the English as a second language course. So it's keeping people from going to church, which was part of the intent. So I think public witness, I'd say, to your question, where can we show public witness against things going on that show who we are as the church and what we believe the church and America needs to be.
Yeah, in fact, actually, kind of building up on that, Frederick Douglass, who was quoted quite a lot in this film because he was indeed really just a very wise person who spoke the truth, the power. And one of the things that Frederick Douglass said, and I will quote him poorly, so paraphrase him, was that the level of injustice that we see in a society is equivalent to the level of injustice that a people will accept. Right. And so when we talk about, when you ask, what do I see as the greatest threat to our democracy? Sure, I could give a laundry list of the things that happen every day that we're seeing. But the greatest threat of our democracy is the complacency of a people. And so I think I've often wondered what were some of the conversations that were going on, not in the walls of power, but in the neighborhoods and at the coffee shops during times of the development of other totalitarian regimes, be it in Nazi Germany,
Right.
be it in Italy. And so we need to learn from that. And so I think the greatest threat to our democracy are people who will be complacent and feel as if this too shall pass. But it won't pass if we don't find ways to resist and hold on to our democracy, which I will continue to say means holding on to our humanity. And so to me, that's the greatest threat. And again, it's Frederick Douglass's words that ring true to me.
Such strong agreement with that. Douglass was a Christian who talked about the importance of resisting false Christianity with the true faith and gospel. But I'm wondering, Kelly, if where that comes from, and I'm more and more thinking, to your point, it probably more may come at the local level than the national level, because national churches and even institutions are being threatened. The Trump administration is doing an attack on nonprofits, on endowment funds, taxing. And I'm hearing a lot of institutions saying, wait a minute, we need to be careful, slow down, we don't know what's going to happen to us. And it may be that pastors, clergy, It was 3 denominations of rabbis are in this lawsuit too. It's Christian and Jewish both. So maybe at the local level, pastors and lay leaders and organizers who are already organizing but aren't church related, maybe this is going to happen in organic ways from the bottom up, not so much from the top down.
Yeah, I think that's the way change always occurs. We
That's
learned
right.
that from
That's right.
Joanne Bland as we were down at the pilgrimage, and
Yeah.
there that change always occurs from the bottom up. It always occurs from the people who are on the underside that are feeling the raw realities
Yeah.
Right.
of injustice, right? That the people that are not receiving any privilege from the realities of injustice, for those of us who may enjoy some modicum of privilege in an unjust system aren't likely the people that are going to rise up, right? But so I think that that is often the case, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so if a democracy is a government for the people, by the people and all that, then the people have to be the ones to claim their democracy.
It's a great segue to a question from the audience that just says, I've been discussing this with friends as things change rapidly. What does resistance look like moving forward?
Yeah, you know, I think that we all have a role to play, and we don't have to all do the same thing. But resistance certainly, you know, looks like even in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities, in our own homes, you know, resistance looks like calling the question. It looks like speaking the truth. It looks like challenging people, right? It looks like pointing out that's not right, and all of those things. And so it looks like people willing to engage one another in these what they consider uncomfortable conversations, right? And so it looks like that, even as it looks like on more sort of macro levels, those levels of protest, those levels of pushing back. It looks like not remaining silent in relationship to your, if you still believe that the government functions at all, in relationship to your representatives. And it looks like for the church, for faith communities, I always say that one of the things that it means, and so this briefly, to be religious, right, is that as religious people, whatever way in which you express your religion, for religious people, we've asked and answered a question, and that is there more, right, to life than this, right? Is there more to life than this, what we call justice? Is there more to life than this? We've said there's more. That's what it means to be religious. There's more. And so our task is to always reach for and try to be the more. And I think that our faith communities have to lead right the way in that. And so that even means showing people there is more to life than acting unkindly toward each other, right? And so I think we lead the way in that, and that we can do that on individual levels, in relationship, and then it moves out. And so I think there's a role for all of us to play, and to be sure we have to, in the places in which we find ourselves, to speak out, to speak back, to push back, and to talk about what's not right. It's not right to eliminate DEI and all of these things. And so to me, that's what it looks like. And to be sure, our faith communities have to take the lead in this.
An example of that is Bishop Buddy, because here we are. I've been to those services after an election, and normally it's controlled by the party that wins and the president who wins. And the cathedral had decided to do a service their way and not just succumb to whoever won the election. So there she is. You've all seen it. It's been seen around the world. And what a venue. Here's the president and the vice president, and there's Rousey sitting there. And she so courageously made her plea for mercy. But the truth is, none of us are going to have that venue like she had. We all have our venues. We all have influence. We all have places and spheres where we're listened to. And so to me, what she represents is the courage of a woman of faith, a leader in the church, to speak the truth to power. And so, but all the venues are important. She's met with a lot of us afterwards and say, all your venues are as important as mine was. So how do we do that in all the venues that we have where we are influencers?
All right. I have a question that just came in to Adam. Why is the Catholic Church not part of in the film? Does not play a part in the film?
Well, it was. I would say it wasn't. It's probably more something on our end. We did have some. We did have a sequence that we filmed at the National Museum of African American History, where we actually had it was a group discussion with a whole range of folks, Catholics, Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists. They were having a dialogue conversation about an exhibit that they had just seen at the museum. But it was one of those editorial moments where it's just like, how well does this, can we, the documentary becomes so big at a certain point that you have to kind of like find ways of reining it in. But yeah, I do agree. We probably should have had a strong Catholic interview, which I'm not sure why that, when I'm thinking about it now, why that didn't happen, but that would have been important. Yeah. But and I guess there's also another part of the story that we didn't include the film, but there's also a misconception that African Americans are all Protestant, right? That they're, but there are Black Catholics, there are Black Buddhists, there are Black Jews, and within that, we had a very interesting. We only had one piece of him, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who in his interview, which we didn't use, but he talked about Jews of all hues, that that even within Judaism, that African American Jews are they're almost not seen as Jews. They're like, well, you're not. I mean, they're included, but then they're also outside. So they have their own issues within Judaism that they're trying to deal with. But I guess my kind of weak answer is that we have to find a way of connecting all the dots in the film. And unfortunately, we didn't connect that dot, which I think we could have.
There's a little bit when I think about Catholicism. I'm a Catholic. It's so rooted in tradition, and the Catholic Church goes so far back. And in the documentary, we see both ways that Christian religion has even kind of symbolically or artistically associated white people with supremacy, over Black people, including its nearly universal depiction of Jesus is white, the devil is black or red. So how can Christian religious organizations, start to change that entrenched messaging to give everyone equal footing in the eyes of God when it's just been hundreds of years of this type of symbolism?
Yeah.
Thousands.
One.
No, I don't know if I feel that you would have a much better answer to this than I do.
No, well, I don't
She's
know.
ready.
But one of the things, we went through this at the National Cathedral when we took out the Confederate windows. But one of the things, in our institutions, in our churches, in our faith institutions, when we talk about the iconography and the other things within the church, I always say, you got to do an audit of the fabric in your church. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What story is your church or your religion, what story is it telling, mm-hmm. right? do an audit of the fabric. And our religious iconography is not only telling a story about the people that are in the church and the history of that institution, but it is suggesting a story about God. Right?
Yeah.
And so to have, for instance, as I sit at the cathedral, to have Confederate windows as if these Confederate generals are heroes, we're also suggesting something about who God is, that God, there's some sacred canopy over white supremacy, right?
Right.
So one is to do this audit in the fabric of our churches, because that's telling a story. The other thing, and this came through in the film as well, and it's even more sort of present today when we know that the history of who we are as a nation and our road to democracy is being erased, right? You cannot at all, in any way, shape, or form, talk about race. And that's happening in our schools. That's got to go. It's happening on the university level, got to go. And I'm in a higher education, and we're seeing all these letters every day coming from the quote unquote Department of Education telling you what you can't say and can't do. However, our religious institutions can. And so that somehow these religious institutions have to be the places where we teach our communities, teach our children about our history and who we are. So whether it's in book clubs, Bible studies, or whatever those studies are, one of the things about the Black church tradition, right, is that the Black church has always filled in the gaps that society has created, right? And so as W.B. Du Bois would say, the Black church has been both the religious center and the social center. And so it has filled in the gaps in terms of social needs, and it's filled in the educational gaps. So the first Black schools came out of the Black church. One can, was that me?
I coughed into my mic, sorry.
one can learn from that. And so one of the things that our churches and faith institutions can do is tell the story. You know, as Richard Rothstein said in his book, The Color of Law, that if we expect the next generation, if we expect our children to be any better than we have been on building a more just society, then we have to begin to change the history and the narrative and the story of what we're telling our children. And our faith communities can do that, particularly in a time when the story of this nation and the story of people who are blessed with anything other than ivory grace, when that story is being erased. And so those are the things that we can do.
Confederate windows in the cathedral are like Georgetown, where I teach. Georgetown survived financially because they sold 242 slaves. And reparations. They're trying to figure out, like you are, reparations. And that process in Virginia Theological has got a whole reparations process for slaves who families still live around the seminary, who served the seminary. And those processes of reparations, which the church can lead, as you said, really can make people, it isn't just reparations, it's making people think and reflect about who God is, who the church is, and what kind of nation we want to be. And I'm hoping, I don't know if I can say this will happen, but I'm hoping that this crisis we're in could lead the church into a deeper place than we've been. So it's not just sort of, let's keep making incremental progress. That's where we've been stuck for a long time. How much progress? Of course, we got to go further, people like us would say. But I think this moment it's shaking things up. It's shaking the whole country up. And it might even shake the churches up. And if it could bring us back to the teaching that we've always done, the serving we've always done, and the speaking of truth to power, this moment could somehow shake us up and expand more than any of us can imagine right now, going deeper. I always say, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. How do we go deeper? And this crisis moment may help us to do that by remembering who we are and what the Black church has already done, and a whole generation of young believers who are white believers. They're rejecting all of what they have grown up with. And a lot of them are saying, we'd like to join with Black and brown church leaders and create what I would call a new remnant church. What does that look like and feel like? And this crisis may guide us in how to do that.
I have a final question. Let's focus a little on the next generation, if you will. And I think, Jim, it was you that actually talked about how in 2040, am I remembering correctly, 2040, there'll be more multiracial people than white people in America for the first time. So, given the statistic that we heard, I think it's 75% of white people have no friends of color. How does this impact the work to create more bridges across our increasingly multiracial society?
Is that asking me?
Jim, I'll ask you since you have
that
paid some
is-
attention to the future
That
here.
is changing for a new generation. We're both teachers, and you can speak to yours too. My classes are just so full of diversity. And the best thing, at the end of my class last semester, one of them said, a lot of our classes here are diverse, but we just check it off and say we're diverse. And I see us living into our diversity. So there's a new generation that doesn't want that. Now, there's also a lot of young men armed with guns.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of young people running around with different views. But I think this could be a moment where the reason I grew up in a white church, because my dad came back from World War II, Navy guy, and he got FHA loan for a house, GI Bill for education. And Black GIs on his ship didn't get that. So it was created, racialized geography, made my church and my school all white. And I think a lot of people now are saying, wait a minute. Either we're going to succumb to what's happening now by being silent, by, as Tim Snyder says, obeying in advance. Either we're going to succumb to that, or we're going to say, no, this is a time to say no to that and go in a deeper way to something else. I don't know. I'm more hopeful than I would have been if I'm not with these students every single day of the week. Harvard?
I think the reality certainly is the reality that we know, and it's one of the reasons in which we're seeing the sort of white supremacist pushback, because hanging on, as Robbie Jones would say, whiteness hanging on by the hair of their chinny chin chins, because in fact we know that this nation is quickly becoming, if not already has become, a majority minoritized nation, right? Because those who we call minorities or minoritized aren't really a minority demographic. And so that's why we're seeing the pushback, right? And so I think the reality of the matter is that the next generation is not that, but it is our responsibility. It is this generation's responsibility to make sure that indeed we impart to this next generation the kind of values that would indeed allow them to continue to live into what it means to be a multicultural, multiracial people. The people that I like to say the people that God has created us to be. You know, just look out at the world. You know, it's not binary. It's not black and white. It's not hetero or non-hetero. We have a very multicultural, very diverse, very rich creation. That's just who we are. And so we can't passively sit back and expect our children, they won't have certain things in their classrooms, et cetera, et cetera. We can't expect them to pick something up by osmosis, because what they're going to pick up is what they're being socialized into, which is the intent of what's going on in the government right now. And so what we have to do is to be proactive. You know, I often wonder, what are the I know the conversations that I had to have with my son growing up. I said, what are the conversations that white people are having in their households? As we talked about in the film, and the student, as we walked across the bridge, you know, as the white parents are driving across the bridge with their children, what are they saying to their children about what happened on this bridge and the street? That's important. So that we change the narrative, and we have to take responsibility for how we raise our kids and the values that they will have. And so we can have a very multi-cultural, if you will, multi-colorful next generation, but that does not necessarily mean that they are going to have a different kind of consciousness unless we are intent about doing something about that.
Story that proves that. Was a Little League baseball coach for 28 seasons. And when my kids got to be 10, 11, 12, in the dugout we'd have these conversations. And with permission of the black players, I told the white players about the talk that all their black teammates had with their mom or dad about policing, about how to behave when you see a policeman. And they got permission from their black parents to tell those stories. And one of the kids told what the talk was like. And all the white kids, and most of their white liberal parents in DC, didn't know about the talk either, frankly. And these kids, they didn't respond the way that people say kids respond. I feel guilty and shamed, and I'm responsible. They were pissed off. They were pissed off that their classmates and teammates had this talk said to them that wouldn't said to us. And so my experience is that when the facts, when the realities, when the stories are told, and it's more stories than facts, it's people's experience. Here's what my dad said to me about the police, what I have to do. Those stories, if we tell them, I think could really be heard. I've seen it happen with 12-year-old baseball players who ended up studying systematic racism the rest of their lives and have changed their careers because of these facts. So doing exactly what she's saying is important for us to do to help a new generation stand up and speak up.
Adam, do you have any final thoughts on that, the next generation and where you believe things are?
Only in terms of what you're saying in regards to telling these stories, as a filmmaker, I'm telling these stories, and one of the threats that, relate to, us, we're here in the National Press Club, is our press freedom, right. Our ability to, our very ability to tell these stories and to get these narratives out there is under threat. And that's very scary. I'd never thought, making this film a few years ago, now making this film, I'm like, well, wait a minute, I didn't come into this trying to be a soldier or a fighter for this. This is just more of an academic, but who knows? When you put this sort of information out there, which I think it should be out there, obviously, but in this new world, it doesn't feel like that is welcomed in any way, and we do need to, as journalists, fight for our ability to speak out, because as you say, even nonprofits are being threatened. You can't. Oh no, you can't say anything, and they're going after everyone, and that's it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild.
Which is why I'm so glad we're able to have this conversation tonight, and your documentary did come out, I think, at quite the time. You know, it's a little bit like fate, how it works, to be able to have this discussion. Thank you so much, all three of you, and thank you for allowing us to screen your documentary.
We thank our filmmaker.
And just let me take a moment to thank the Headliners team and Club Executive Director Didier Saugy, and also thank you to our audience. I know it's a long night, it's a long event. We hope you will join us on Wednesday, March 12th for a special program presented by the Press Freedom Center at the National Press Club to analyze the October 13th, 2023 attack on journalists from Reuters, Agence France Presse, and Al Jazeera. Additionally, Friday, March 28th, we're hosting Career Day at the National Press Club. If you're looking for your next journalism or communication job, this is the place to find it. And now my final act as moderator tonight is to present the three of you with our very coveted National Press Club mugs. You can pass that down. Goes to all of our speakers who have ever come here since we created those mugs. So thank you very much. Oh, that was